We will be addressing the foreign policy challenges Turkey is facing, Turkey's relations with Russia and NATO and the United States, and we have a great panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Barbara Slavin, who has kindly accepted our offer to moderate this afternoon's discussion. Barbara is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative, and she's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University and a columnist for Al Monitor, which is a web-based devoted to news from and about the Middle East. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you, MEI and FES, for asking me to moderate this panel. I love an excuse to talk about something other than Iran every now and then, and Turkey is certainly a pivotal country in that part of the world. We have a great panel. We're going to, maybe I'll introduce each of our speakers before they speak, but I'm going to start with our remote panelist, General Votel. Can you hear me? Excellent. We are very pleased to have General Joseph Votel. He is a distinguished senior fellow on national security at MEI, but as you all know, he recently retired as a four-star general in the United States Army after a nearly 40-year career, culminating in his leadership of Central Command, of CENTCOM. And he has, of course, wide experience in the region in Afghanistan and Iraq, and has won many, many awards. So we are thrilled to have you with us, and the timing could not be better. We've just had this NATO mini-summit in London, which fortunately seems to have concluded without a major crisis. But let me come to you, if I may, General Votel, to talk about this whole issue of Turkey's membership in NATO and whether Turkey is behaving appropriately as a member of NATO. I just read on the Al Monitor website this morning that Turkey is asking Russia for even more S-400s than it currently possesses. So is this appropriate for a NATO member? How are we supposed to navigate this relationship that Turkey is building with Russia?
Thanks, Barb. It's great to be with all of you, and thanks for the question. So the quick answer right up front is no. Certainly, this is not what we would expect from a NATO member, any NATO member, much less Turkey here, to act towards Russia in this particular case. And I think it really exemplifies just how far the universal values and interests that drove all member states of NATO together, to include Turkey, drove us together, now seem to be diverging, particularly in the case of Turkey. Their interests, their values are very clearly diverging from this. I think you have to kind of look back a little bit at why Turkey came into NATO. They were in the first expansion. They joined with Greece, and they actually joined before West Germany became a member of NATO. And really, as a key mechanism here to contain communist expansion and help us establish a foothold to the linkages and a bridge to the Middle East by their geographic position. And of course, we've seen them operate in the past as kind of a model of stability and democratic Islam. They've got a big army. They're key partners in many of the things we're doing. Certainly during my time at CENTCOM, we deeply valued Turkey's contributions in Afghanistan. They're a stakeholder country here, and really provide forces that help secure the critical air base in Kabul, and without which would be very, very difficult for the NATO mission to move forward. And of course, they're a NATO host. Meaning that they allow a lot of NATO activity not only on their territory, but they are actually hosting one of the major ground commands. So this is pretty significant. And in a number of years here past the Cold War, as I mentioned, we've seen this divergence take place. And so it really does draw into question whether Turkey can be a reliable partner as we move forward here. And I think the question is, I think the answer is, I don't know that we can look at them as being a reliable partner anymore. Not following through with some of the sanction requests we've asked them to do. Certainly this relationship with Russia is something different. Working against kind of our coalition activities in Syria certainly would seem to argue that they don't really merit that. In fact, my own recent reading here had some describe Turkey as perhaps moving into the zone of being a frenemy. That is not necessarily a friend, but not necessarily an enemy either, kind of in the middle. And so I think this will pose a big challenge to not just the United States, but NATO, as we look at how this relationship moves forward.
Let me just follow up with one technical question. I was talking earlier with some people about the S-400. Supposedly the Turks are not going to connect it up in any way with their American-supplied equipment. I was thinking sort of having an electronic device that somehow is not compatible with all your other devices. What purpose will the S-400 serve from a military perspective for Turkey if they're going to try to isolate it from the rest of their weaponry?
I don't know, and I think this is one of the things I think that finds very, very confusing. And so, are they buying S-400s just to spite us, or to further their relationship with Russia? That I think is perhaps the question that has to answer. It seems like it wouldn't be certainly optimizing the system that they bought here. That said, whether they connect it up, whatever they do, it is incompatible with the technologies that we are fielding in NATO. Certainly with our F-35, and it's a system that's specifically designed to address that type of capability. So I just don't see how any of this can be compatible here. But as to Turkey's motivations here, I can only imagine that this might just go back to their and Russia's long distrust of the West, their very overriding focus on sovereignty and independence, and we're going to do what we want to do kind of approach. And that could be part of it. As a military guy, I wouldn't necessarily think that way. I think they're looking for capabilities, and so I think we have to look at it seriously and through that light.
Okay, we're going to turn next to Ivan Safranchuk, who is Associate Research Scholar and Lecturer at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. He is an expert on defense policy from Russia, has worked at the Pearce Center for Policy Studies, headed the Moscow office of the Center for Defense Information, was deputy director of the Institute of Contemporary International Studies, and also served as an advisor to the president of the Diplomatic Academy of Kyrgyzstan. So, привет. Let me turn to you and ask from the Russian perspective, what do you think Turkey is up to? Is this a political statement by Erdogan buying the S-400s, asking for more S-400s? Is it because Erdogan wants to have Russian support for whatever his goals may be in Syria in terms of suppressing the Kurds, perhaps? Are Russia and Turkey really drawing closer in foreign policy terms, and what does that portend?
I would rather say that Russia and Turkey are getting similar in their foreign policy patterns and in the patterns of how they behave, in particular regionally, but also with other big powers. So it's not necessarily getting closer to each other, but it's getting somewhere on the same side. And that gives me a very good chance to address something very basic, what I think is sometimes ignored when we address current political issues. And that is the following. Russia and Turkey have something strategically in common. Both countries are somewhere between Europe and Asia. And there was, all the modern times, there was the problem for both these countries. They solved it, they tried to solve it individually, that to be materially successful, to develop you need to modernize. And the only pattern of modernization is the European pattern, the pattern of European modernity. So to become yourself, to become strong, you need to become less yourself. And they could never decide finally whether they are ready to abandon their traditions to become fully materially successful, or they are ready to abandon some part of material success and development for the sake of continuing their strategic traditions. And this was going for centuries, and that was always a strategic problem for each of these countries. However, very unexpectedly, globalization gave them the opportunity to be very traditional and successful at the same time. And they are learning how to exercise it. What the theory told us was that if you become too traditional in this global world, then all old historical grievances come up, but with even more risks, because you are more interconnected and you are closer to each other and you have more power. And we see that some historical grievances between Russia and Turkey do come up. There are very tough disagreements on many issues. For example, even on Ukraine. Turkey and Russia definitely have different views on Ukraine. On Crimea, there are different views. But at the same time, we see that these historical disagreements do not overtake them and do not create those historical tendencies which usually were leading them to very tough relationship and to many, many wars. Actually, there are two countries in the Russian history with which Russia had most wars. This is Sweden and Turkey.
We should be the first one.
Yes, but Sweden is slightly behind, something like 8 or 9. So that is the issue, that all grievances, all disagreements, historical disagreements, very, very deeply rooted, do come up. But they do not bring the two countries to hostilities. Something else keeps them together. And I think that is exactly the very commonly shared and maybe not fully consciously conceptualized understanding that they learn to be powerful non-Europe. And they do not need anymore to, they think they do not need anymore to choose between being powerful and being non-Europe. Now they can do both. The very big question, if that is just a temporarily distortion of the historical dilemma I've just mentioned, or that is a new pattern and new model. Both countries would like that to be a new model, and they help each other to look in this way.
You mentioned Europe, but how much of what is pulling Erdogan and Putin together these days is anger at the United States?
That is partly true, but I think that that actually their relations started even when both countries were not that much at odds with the United States. Their personal relationship started when Russia was doing quite well with the United States, when Erdogan was serving his first term. I think that is part of the picture, but I think personal relationship as such is very important. This type of leaders who are traditional and powerful at the same time, this is not just Erdogan and Putin. This was Sharon to some extent, to much extent. This is Netanyahu. Now this is the chairman of China, President Xi, who is also learning that. And I think that all of them are somehow interested to help each other to make that story to come true. And they would like to help each other to be successful. But you are right, that is all necessary until they have another pattern, which is the United States and NATO and the all European and Western model. If that is taken away, would they be overtaken again by their historical grievances? We don't know so far.
Okay. Now, let us turn to our Turkish panelist. Aydin Selcan is a columnist at Gazette Duvar in Duvar English. She hosts a political talk show and analyzes foreign policy issues, but he was also part of the Turkish Foreign Ministry for some years and was actually stationed here in Washington not so long ago. So I'd love to get your take on this. How deep is this new relationship between Turkey and Russia? Is it based primarily on personalities, on the fact that Erdogan and Putin are cut from similar molds, or would like to think that they are? Is it partly a function of disagreements with the United States over Syria, over the attempted coup and Fethullah Gulen and all of the rest? Is it something really substantial, or is it just a kind of fleeting phase?
Thank you. Also, allow me to briefly seize the opportunity to thank my good friend Gönül Tol, who kindly invited me to Washington, D.C. And as you pointed out, I was based here from 2008 till 2010. And since then, I didn't have the opportunity to come back. So I wish to thank MEI and Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for their warm hospitality, generous hospitality, and it's a privilege and honor for me to be part of this distinguished panel. I may add, actually, I was thinking along the same points, even if you didn't ask me the question. I was going to touch upon.
You were going to answer.
Yeah, I was going to add some points. When it comes to, I think quite along the same lines with Dr. Safranchuk when it comes to the similar outlooks of foreign policy and the two countries learning from each other, but maybe mostly Mr. Erdogan emulating Mr. Putin's style in a way. And when we put the relation of these two countries under the microscope, again, as Dr. Safranchuk pointed out, we fought with Russia for 11 times, and we lost 10 times. And the one time when a war was won, it was the Crimean War, and actually that was Britain and France who won the war, and alongside the two, Turkey also had a first victory. And then following that war, actually, the Paris Conference in 1856 sort of anchored Turkey and then Ottoman Empire into Europe as a part of the member of European nations family. Mm-hmm. That should be remembered. But yes, this is true that maybe it can be seen as a deep and historic animosity between the two neighbors. But these are the two regional powers, and at certain times Russia or the Soviet Union was a global power as well. Yet between an exceptional time period of, say, by the end of the Second World War till 1960, beyond that brief 15 years, Turkey was never really solely only pro-American in its foreign policy outlook, and there was always some sort of cooperation between Moscow and Ankara. So that should be taken into consideration. I don't believe that from that angle, Ankara, today's government, can be criticized or cannot be asked to push aside Russia and to concentrate only on EU and US. When it comes to S-400s, this air defense strategy, generally speaking, although of course I should be embarrassed to get into that military strategy subject sitting next to General Votel, but it's a general knowledge, common knowledge that I'm going to share with you. Turkey's air defense was based on the deterrence of the strength of its air force. But for the first time, after the failed coup attempt of 15th of July, we have now more warplanes than pilots. So the air defense system needed to be switched or perhaps there was a strategical decision that I'm not privy to in Ankara to switch from having that deterrent air force to have a proper air defense system. But it is also a fact that these S-400 batteries, even if there are additional batteries to be brought from Russia, they can only offer certain protective bubbles. So according to some, this bubble will protect Ankara or maybe the government center or perhaps the presidential palace. But that's only, it's actually we don't know, because we couldn't hear neither from President Erdogan nor from Minister of Defense, General Akar, the real mission of these S-400s. And when it comes to rhetoric, it was repeated time and again by especially the foreign minister, Mr. Çavuşoğlu, that Turkey is ready to buy Patriots as well and all sorts of different, or even from European Union as well. So it's not the, I mean, it was just because we couldn't get any other air defense system we turned to. That this is the explanation offered by the government. But it has a price tag, a political price tag attached to it, and that is the, that will or will not be the sanctions. But till now, yes, Mr. Zanotti may be speaking on that issue. Yes, these Turkey-US relations now, since President Trump is elected, is on a one-on-one basis at top level. The foreign ministry is sidelined definitely, but not only the foreign ministry is sidelined, everyone else beyond number ones, beyond President Trump and President Erdogan, they're also sidelined. So this is between the two leaders. This is an interesting, really new approach to diplomacy. It's a diplomacy without diplomats, actually. So that's a fact. And till today, it worked. I'm on the record on saying on TV and also writing in Duvar and other outlets that I was wrong actually, because I predicted that it was not going to work and it was doomed to failure, this approach, one-on-one approach. But it worked till now. And we don't know whether it is not going to work from now on either, actually. Yes, if you go by the book, there should be an end to this, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot, as they say, sell the butter, eat the butter at the same time, spend the money you make from the butter and save some more. So there should be a give and take. But that was not the case, and we will see. And that the geopolitical, which I call the real estate value of Turkey on the world map, till now, it was used and recycled and reused, and it worked. With the European Union, it worked, especially with the added threat of opening the doors and sending because Turkey is host to almost 4 million Syrians, which do not have refugee status, but which have special status. So that works with the European Union, and to a certain extent, again, that geopolitical value, and perhaps the fact that Iran now is on the first, is the first subject on the agenda, maybe for that matter, or maybe for Iraq or for Syria, for other reasons that I may not know, that worked with the US as well. So it remains to be seen where do we go from here. With Russia, it will, I believe it is also contradictory, because in Libya, for example, Turkey works with the government recognized by UN, while Mr. Putin backs, for example, General Haftar's LNA. In Idlib, in Syria, yes, Turkey and Russia and Iran are part of the Astana process, but when it comes to the reasons why they are in Syria, for example, Turkey, when it comes to its position against President Assad, then it is more closer to the European powers and US powers. So these are all different contradictions that we have to live with. And last but not the least, for people like me, Actually, we are just doing armchair quarterbacking, so to speak, because it is a close circle that is running the show in Ankara. We do not have the opportunity to have one-on-one dialogue with these people. So it is like you have to be a little bit like a Kremlinologue, so to speak, to try to figure out what is going on. At the same time, President Erdogan has a very transparent approach. Why? Because he handpicks the journalists to accompany him to foreign visits. Okay, you can criticize him, but he is vocal on his way to somewhere to meet Trump, for example, recently here in DC, and on his way back from these meetings to Moscow and to other places. He is quite vocal, and he is just saying almost everything that was discussed. So we can also have a quite good idea of what is going on. That's it.
Let me ask you one follow-up, and that is this relationship between Trump and Erdogan is rather unique. I mean, they talk on the phone, and Trump does what Erdogan tells him to, it seems. Is there concern in Turkey that if Trump is not reelected, that there could be a bigger crisis in U.S.-Turkish relations because perhaps the next president would not have this kind of relationship with President Erdogan? Or you're not thinking that far ahead?
Yes, actually, it is difficult to think that far ahead. But that much I know that before Mr. Trump was elected as president of the United States of America, Ankara's thinking was that he wouldn't be winning. So almost they bet on the opposite side. So it came quite as a surprise. But also the way that it worked till now, especially through, how should I put it? Should I say extra diplomatic ways? I mean, or the back channel diplomacy through
businessmen and
businessmen and like Mr. Yalçında or Mr. Albayrak, and their opposite number is Mr. Kushner, for example. It is working, and it kind of there is almost a disdain towards Turkish foreign ministry, yes, but also it overlooks the fact that Congress has a say, the administration, the White House, the NSA, the State Department, but that's not in the picture. It's so probably nobody would be happy if Trump is not re-elected, but whether it will change drastically Turkey's relations with the U.S., I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue to our last speaker, last but not least. Jim Zanotti is a specialist in Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service, where he covers Turkey, Kurdish issues, Israel, and the Palestinians. So all small topics. One of the things that's been interesting to see during this period of the Trump administration is the extent to which Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has disagreed with the president on certain areas of foreign policy. I'm thinking in particular about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the turnaround on Saudi Arabia since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And on Turkey, for years and years, Armenia resolutions, Armenia is the genocide that took place in Armenia against Armenians, the resolutions were proposed, they never went through. This year it's different. Has Congress turned against Turkey in a certain way? Will that remain the case as long as Erdogan is there and is carrying out the kinds of policies that he is? And what is happening with sanctions? Can the president stave off the sanctions that Congress has passed forever?
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. I also feel very privileged and honored to be a part of this panel. Just to, at the outset, state the views that I will share today are mine alone. They do not represent the views of the Congressional Research Service. To the first question of this notion of has Congress turned against Turkey, I think it might still be a little too early to say. And part of that comes from the fact that aside from countries that are aid dependent, on the United States. And so if you look at Turkey's surrounding region, you might look at Jordan, perhaps arguably Egypt. You really need an overwhelming veto-proof congressional majority in both houses to override the president's plans on foreign policy. And so it's hard, even though clearly there has been quite a bit of bipartisan objection to both Turkey's policies on a range of things, and then in particular with regard to what took place in October in Syria, how the president handled it. There's still this sort of fence-sitting group, in particular of Republican senators, and that was perhaps most visible when you had a number of Republican senators who were actually meeting with the president, with President Erdogan when he came in November, just last month. To set the scene in terms of sanctions, Congress enacted, and of course the president signed, what we call CATSA, which is an acronym for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And that was in October of 2017. And the whole sort of framework of that act is to create for third parties, it's essentially to dissuade third parties from purchasing significant Russian military platforms. 2 months later, of course, big announcement from Turkey and Russia that Turkey was planning to purchase the S-400 system. And the drumbeat began for, okay, Trump administration, when are you going to impose sanctions on Turkey? And what's interesting is, so to date, under CATSA, there's been one imposition of sanctions, and that's been on China for purchasing Russian fighters, Su-35s, and also S-400 components. And there was actually a congressional hearing in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just yesterday, where you had the State Department Assistant Secretary, I believe, Christopher Ford, for International Security and Non-Proliferation actually speak to this question, where he basically said it took us 8 months from the time that the Chinese acquired these components to actually impose the CATSA sanctions on China. And it's been about 4 months and change since the Turks actually began to take possession of the S-400. So it was an interesting thing, partly because in CATSA, even though there's quite a bit to it, it does not explicitly talk about timing, talk about triggering events. It talks about significant transaction, but it doesn't say when that transaction will be deemed to have taken place. And so because of that, it appears as though the administration has quite a bit of wiggle room to interpret that. And so then you have this question of whether, if the administration chooses not to invoke CATSA or to wait for a future date. We had a statement from Secretary of State Pompeo not too long ago, where he talked about the idea of full operationalization. And I think the reason why he used that terminology was because just recently, just in the past couple of weeks, there was a test of reportedly, of the S-400's radar system over Ankara. And so the Pompeo statement was read by many to hint at this notion that until the system's fully operational, we reserve judgment before actually imposing sanctions. Now, so then the question is, if the administration doesn't act, will Congress compel it to act? And again, that lies within this question of, can you get this compelling veto-proof majority in both houses? Senator McConnell went on record and as kind of a put the brakes on things, even though you had a sanctions bill that was linked with Syria and was also then going to trigger CATSA for the S-400 purchase, pass overwhelmingly in the House. Senator McConnell basically said, well, let's take some time to consider what would be the effects. What would that lead Turkey to do? How would the Turkish people react? Would they back Erdogan? Would they back us? what would the effects be, the ripple effects be, because Turkey's economy is so entwined with Europe's economy. So what would those ripple effects be? And so in essence, there was a bit of a holding pattern there. And of course, you have not only this question of counting votes, but especially when you have the Senate Majority Leader saying this, the question of procedurally, are you going to even bring it to the floor? Now, what's interesting is that you have a couple of senators, Senator Menendez, Senator Murphy, who not too long ago introduced something on the Senate that could potentially actually go around, sort of as a workaround to the normal procedural stuff that makes the Senate the deliberative body that we know and love. And that is, under a certain provision of the Foreign Assistance Act, you get privileged consideration of a motion that would require the Secretary of State to report on human rights practices having to do with the use of weapons. So in this case, Turkey's use of weapons in northern Syria. And then depending on A, if the report is filed in a timely manner, and B, the substance of that report, there is the option to have another privileged motion. It's a joint resolution that, again, could basically compel the Senate to go up or down. And so if you end up with that kind of situation, given the climate where you have such bipartisan opposition to what the president has done, to what Turkey has done, then maybe all bets are off at that point. So that gives a little bit of a sense of things.
Let me ask a follow-on. What exactly would the sanctions be that would be imposed on Turkey? Does CATSA give you a menu of things, and so could the president pick something relatively innocuous? How damaging could those sanctions be?
It does. It's a menu of, there are 12 sanctions that are laid out, and the president is required to pick, I believe, 5 of those sanctions. So he's supposed to impose at least 5. I think he can probably do more if he chooses to. And they do range from focusing more like what we might know as Magnitsky type sanctions that are focusing on blocking assets of specific people or focusing on specific transactions, to something that's broader, exports, trade, financial plumbing, things like Turkey's ability to access foreign exchange and that sort of thing, which could potentially have some major effects on Turkey's economy. So it could, how the administration would choose to implement these sanctions could very much depend.
Okay. We're going to open up to your questions in just a second, but I wanted to go back to General Votel and ask specifically about the situation in Syria. What are the Turks up to now? Have they been dissuaded from continuing to go after the Kurds in the way that they began to after the president announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the border? How do you see that situation? How long do you think U.S. troops are going to be in Syria, even in the somewhat more remote area where they're now stationed?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. I think those are all really, really great questions here. I think the way as a military man, or a military person, I would think about this is that I think Turkey is kind of in the consolidation phase here, if you will. I don't know if they got everything that they wanted to get before these agreements came into place here, but I think what they are continuing to do is continue to consolidate their position as best they can to support their objectives. By all reports that I have seen, there continues to be violence as part of this, and there does continue to be a level of attacks that are perhaps going both ways here over this in these disputed areas. So I think that is continuing on. But to answer your question directly, I think what Turkey is trying to do is they're trying to consolidate this, trying to make it a fact of life as to what is taking place here, and then we'll continue to move forward with the objectives that they have. And my observation from having, from CENTCOM, very, very close, looking at it very closely for 3 years, and my time before that at SOCOM, is that they will continue to press for their objectives in this area to the best that they can. I think we are starting to see a little bit of friction, perhaps between Turkey and Russia in this area. Again, going back to one of my panel colleagues' comments here, there doesn't seem to be a deal breaker, but there does seem to be some friction between some of what the expectations are that Turkey had of Russia, and vice versa here, in terms of that may be playing out. But I think we're going to continue to see a level of violence here, and I think we're going to continue to see Turkey try to create new facts on the ground.
And in terms of the U.S. presence in Syria,
Well,
how effective
no,
is that at this point in their new location? And how long do you think those troops are going to stay?
Well, I think that's anybody's guess here right now. There are a couple of reasons that have been given for why they're there, depending upon who you talk to. Certainly, I think we've heard the president talk about the fact that they're there for the oil. I think he reiterated that again during his comments in London this week. But we've also heard, my successor talk about the fact that we are restarting or ramping up some of the ISIS operations against ISIS to keep the pressure on them. So I think that I guess the good thing is that we still have some capability there that can serve as a platform on which we can continue to keep pressure on ISIS. I think this is important. By all accounts I've heard, we have managed to maintain a relationship with the Syrian Democratic Forces in this area. And so that relationship, while strained by these policy decisions of late, does not seem to have broken. And I think we will continue to try to do what we need to do to keep the pressure on ISIS. I can't tell you how long we will be there. I don't think that objective has been clarified for us.
Okay. If I could come back to you, Councillor Seljan, on the question of the YPG. Erdogan made an effort to get NATO to declare this group a terrorist group. That was never really in the cards, I think. What do you see as his objective in northern Syria? Do you think that he really is going to try to push refugees across the border into this rather small safe zone at this point? And do you see frictions with Russia over that policy?
Thank you. Now, having left our embassy in DC, actually, I had volunteered to become the first Turkey's first consul general in Erbil, and I served. That was my last post, actually, 3 years, 3 months in Erbil as Turkey's consul general. Why I mention this is because at that time there was this opening period, and a peaceful peace solution process, so-called process, was underway. And that was still under then Prime Minister Erdogan's command, both the peace process and the opening of the Turkish General Consulate in Erbil, deepening of and bringing new dimensions to our relations with Iraqi Kurdistan, so on and so forth. When it comes to Syria and the Kurds in Syria, that is not the same as Iraqi Kurdistan from the perspective of Ankara. By the way, I should also add, as Mr. Zanotti, that the views expressed here are just my own views. I'm not representing anybody. I'm just representing myself. So just a usual disclaimer, so to speak. But Ankara's idea is that unless Turkey is strong on the ground, it cannot negotiate from a position of strength at the table. Mm-hmm. And then also Ankara follows an assertive foreign policy, least to say. And it is also one of its priority is to, there is this feeling of encirclement, and that is going on since actually the end of maybe First World War. And another point is that Turkey should not be cited in the same breath as with countries like, with not belittling or you know, them like Egypt or Jordan. Actually, this is one of the messages also. Do not confuse Turkey, looking at its size, its history, its economy, its military. Do not confuse Turkey with other Middle Eastern powers. It can appear so looking from Washington, D.C., because at the end of the day, USA is the single global power, and it does not wake up every morning working on Turkish file. It is one file among the others. Yet, Turkey also, Ankara, wishes to assert its position. It is also quite similar when it comes to the relations with the EU, and also that's why maybe it appears like going along the same like Russia, this continuous demand of recognition. But in Idlib, it is different. In Idlib, there was an agreement with Russia and Iran, and through Russia, maybe an unwritten agreement with Damascus, that the presence of 14 monitoring posts. But first of all, in Elbab pocket, there was the first military operation in Syria, and US was happy with that actually. That was in cooperation with US, more or less, that was conducted, because it was primarily conducted against ISIL and similar jihadi forces. This is the Euphrates Shield operation. The second one solely targeted the YPG, which is an extension of PKK. Actually, organically speaking, this is a fact, by the way. So I am on the record in criticizing Turkey's Syria policy, because I am of the opinion that there are other alternatives, much cheaper and much smarter alternatives to the present policies. Yet it should be admitted that yes, YPG has organic links with PKK. Anyway, but Afrin, Russia said it's none of our business. USA also said it's out of area for us, and YPG found itself face to face with the Turkish armed forces, and then they decided to withdraw. This was the second, the so-called Olive Branch operation. Now, the third one, the Peace Spring. This is between Tel Abyad and Serekani. It's 120 kilometers, and it is like 30 kilometers deep to reach the M4 highway, and it is successful. I don't know whether if you follow the rhetoric, yes, the aim of Ankara was to secure the entire area from Kobane till Iraqi border, but it was not realistic from day one. And if you look at the way the forces were piled up since actually almost a year, and Erdogan made it clear since more than a year that this operation was going to start, and it was just obvious, it was in plain sight. It targeted this area quite empty of civilian population. It's quite a deserted area between Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. And it is mainly populated by Arabs. So that was the target, and that was to reach M4 highway and to cut the Syrian Democratic Forces controlled area into two. And it is successful on the ground. Now it is fragmented. I mean, the SDF controlled area is fragmented into three parts. At certain parts, there are the regime forces, Syrian Arab Army, backed by the Russian military police. In Kamishli Haseke, already the regime never left. Then the east of Euphrates, southern parts, fight against ISIL is underway with the help of the US forces. And at the extreme, what the French called in the Mandate times in the 20s, the Dax Bec de Canard, the tip, the triangular tip. Remel and surroundings, and that's where also the US forces are positioned, and that area, by the way, is very valuable because of its wheat reserves and also the oil reserves. And the oil, as you know, I mean, all these, by the way, is not significant even from a regional perspective, neither the oil, but it is significant for the regime. So perhaps Washington is happy to keep this now in the gray area, to be able to better negotiate again one day with Damascus, or to stop a deal that will be against the will of Washington D.C. to be implemented, and that is probably what we are witnessing now in Geneva. So on the public diplomacy front, by the way, I should add and admit, it was a total failure, this last operation, because the image, I mean, it's like in the movies, you have the computer-generated image. So we have this government-generated image, but the image, the global image, is definitely negative.
Yeah. One last question, if I may, to Dr. Safranchuk, and that is Russia angry at Turkey, satisfied with Turkey? What does Russia want to see happen in this area? I mean, eventually, presumably, you want to see Assad's government exert authority over the whole country. So how is Russia maneuvering with Turkey here?
I think there is very little emotion in that. That's why no angry, no emotion like that. And no emotion because so far there are opportunities to reconcile practical interests. And that's why if you can make an agreement and that works more or less, then why to become emotional and consolidate your positions in opposition to the other side. And I understand that for Russia, the most important is that the Damascus regime is not challenged in the battlefield, not anymore. So it's militarily saved. What is not secured is the economic reconstruction and revival of the country as such under the rule of this regime. And the United States are quite effectively denying instruments for internal recovery, cutting the regime out of most of the oil production. And then recovery of the regime becomes actually the issue, an international issue, and everyone will have say in that. And then I think that Russia is more or less understanding that, yes, that is going to be an international issue, and let's see how that works. With Turkey in the north, I think what is unacceptable in Russia, if Turkey revives more historic ideas and somehow gets on the track of actually extension of territory. Yes, annexing it in some longer run.
If you'll forgive me, given what's happened in Crimea, is Russia really in a position to complain?
Yeah, that's where your historic, that's where your perception of what you should do from a historic perspective may lead you. And if you know you do it, you probably think that the other side may also do it. So anything what can be consolidated in the future for the policy of annexation, I think is unacceptable for Russia for many, many reasons. And however, the way Turkey is making it now, it is saying that the issue is to secure the Kurdish issue, and for that actually to divide Kurds with Arabs, to put it bluntly. And as that policy of buffering against the Kurdish issue for Turkey, I think that is something acceptable for Russia, because that addresses the Turks' vital security interests as it presents it, and Russia is not denying anybody's vital security interests, but that is not opening way for annexation or anything approximating that. So that is not getting an issue, and then I think it's a compromise. Idlib continues to be
Yeah.
a more difficult issue because things are actually stored there. All the problems are stored there. And what we have now is that it's not that there is disagreement on goals, but there are different levels of acceptance to instruments how to achieve those goals, and that cannot be so far reconciled, and that continues to be an issue of disagreement.
Now, I could ask you guys questions all day, but I'm not going to do that. We have an amazing audience. So let me start here in the front row. I think there are microphones. Yeah? Are there microphones? No microphones? Just, yeah. Please. So state your name, ask a question, and say whether it's directed to one of the panelists. Gentlemen here first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Paulo von Schirach. I'm president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C. On the issue already discussed of the, and it's to the entire panel really, whoever wants to chime in, on the S-400 issue that's already been discussed, it seems to me that we are kind of in an atmosphere of deliberate ambiguity. In other words, yes, they shouldn't do this, but they're doing it. There should be sanctions, but they're not being enforced. The keynote speaker earlier today said that he was hoping, as a German member of parliament, that NATO would take position on the S-400, which really hasn't. I mean, the SACEUR has and said, well, this shouldn't be done, etc. But NATO as an institution has really not sanctioned or done anything to formally, stigmatize or, its own disapproval of Turkey. My question is, are we just going to kick the can down the road for the foreseeable future, whether it's about the sanctions, as you indicated, sir, and again, about this obvious incompatibility of a system that has no place within the NATO air defense systems. So, or where do you see this going? And do you see this matter coming to a head at any point? Of course, there's never been an issue of kicking any member out of NATO. Yeah. This never happened, and there's no provision, to my knowledge, in the NATO treaty about doing anything as drastic as this. Any prophecies?
Yeah, actually, let me go to General Votel first, if I may. I mean, is NATO simply has its hands tied because the United States is not doing anything on this issue? Is there, especially given how delicate the state of U.S. relations within NATO are these days, is we're just going to wait for Washington to take a position on this?
Well, I think that certainly could be the case. I mean, the United States is the leader in NATO, as we are in a number of places, and it is our actions and our words and our approaches that generally convene and bring people together to try to solve these things. And that does not seem to be even much of what was just said by the question asker there has been playing out in our own country in terms of how we're doing it. They got them, but they haven't plugged them in. Wait and see what happens. They're going to test them. We haven't tested them yet, so we can't make a determination. So we've kind of made the decision to do that. And I would agree that I think the deliberate ambiguity is a very good way of describing this. But ultimately, this if this has to be resolved, this will require that NATO, hopefully with U.S. leadership, will come together to have a conversation about how this is going to be addressed and whether the policy is going to be what it has been right now, or whether we will state that it is unacceptable for a member of NATO to act in the manner in which Turkey has pursued some of their objectives here, and will have to be changed. So I think it's very important that the United States play a role in this. I don't see that we are doing that right now.
Yeah. Jim, let me come to you. Sure. How do you think this is going to unfold? We talked a little bit about the sanctions process, this new legislation perhaps in the Senate.
Yeah, I think, so there's an interesting dynamic, and I think I would look to March 2020 and April 2020, because in March, that's the time when Turkey's industrial participation in the F-35 is scheduled to be decoupled from the consortium. And then April is the date where they've said that they intend to have the S-400 fully operational. So between now and then, what's an interesting dynamic that I think some commentators seem to be sensing is you would think that it might make sense for Erdogan to sort of lay low and sort of, you know, try to be inconspicuous, but it seems as though perhaps he's doing the opposite, and it may be because he feels as though the more cards that he feels he has to play, the more he makes U.S. and Western policymakers think twice about what would it look like if Turkey is scorned in some way, and are we going to think twice about that? And so whether that's discussing another iteration of S-400 purchases and maybe even purchasing Russian fighters along with that, returning ISIS fighters to countries of origin, continuing to threaten the EU to let the floodgates open for the refugees, stirring up things in the Eastern Med with the maritime agreement just announced with the Libyans, skirmishes at the margins of the quote-unquote safe zones in northern Syria, linking NATO decisions on the Baltics and Poland to NATO's stance on the YPG, for example. I think that, and I think he might be making a calculation that if it's not just binary, the S-400 or the F-35, that it complicates matters and actually makes it harder. And there's at least some anecdotal evidence to indicate that perhaps he might have a point, because there are these reports that have been leaking out about this question of whether the administration might be willing to talk to Turkey about not just either return the S-400 or we won't give you F-35, or mothball the S-400 and we won't give you the F-35, but is there a way to reduce its coverage in some way that wouldn't endanger the F-35? And so if Erdogan, at least, whether it's true or not, if Erdogan thinks that that's the case, then there may not be really much of a reason for him to stop. I will say one thing. Congress, there have been 5 bills that have come through this year in which these are sort of yearly things, appropriations bills, National Defense Authorization Act, where you've had provisions in there saying basically, if Turkey has the S-400, they're not getting the F-35. And these are hard to veto type, big omnibus type bills. Now, the reality is, because of the difficulty that Congress is having even getting those bills passed, there's kind of the question of if you can get provisions in those bills and those provisions up for a vote, that could tie Turkey's hands, because even if the administration's willing to deal with them, if Congress doesn't give the administration the leeway, even with waiver authority, to transfer those F-35s, then it could be a done deal.
Okay. Lady right there.
Hi, Sharon Weiner, retired FSO and former U.S. Consul General in Istanbul. Aydin, you mentioned that relations between the U.S. and Turkey have recently been a one-on-one deal between Erdogan and Trump, sort of diplomacy without diplomats. Barbara, you mentioned that from Erdogan's point of view, this is kind of nice because he talks to Trump and Trump does what he wants him to do. But I would think in a broader sense, we long-term Turkey-U.S. watchers are very disturbed by the fact that we see the bilateral relationship as being at its lowest level ever. And I understand from my contacts and friends in Turkey that the level of anti-Americanism in Turkey right now is at an all-time low. So I guess I'm curious why you said you thought you expected this one-on-one deal not to work, but that you were surprised that it had worked. Does that mean that you think the relationship would be in even worse shape if it weren't for the relationship between the two presidents? I mean, how do you define successful diplomacy without diplomats?
Go for it.
Actually, thank you very much. It's a question of definitions, really. I mean, you ask me to define certain things. I can also ask you to define lowest level or define this, define that. Actually, this is a way of approaching this issue. Anti-Americanism, yes, it cuts across all the spectrum. There is no single party. If you ask Islamists, if you ask secularists, if you ask nationalists, Kurds, Turks, Alawites, Sunnis, everyone is anti-American more or less. So should we or should you care about this? I don't know. I mean, you served in Istanbul, you were there. Perhaps it was part of your job at the time. Whether it is also that there are certain things to be done or not done, it remains to be seen. But also when it comes to let's say the previous panel was very interesting. I don't know whether you were in the room about art and the subaltern cultural scene in Turkey. The cultural hegemony of US, that is also valid in Turkey. My daughter is 11 years old and her favorite singer is Taylor Swift. And her second favorite singer is Katy Perry. And so if you look at the movies, you can go and see this week Ford versus Ferrari movie. That is aside. When it comes to, I mean, the cooperation, Turkey's membership in NATO, this so-called constructive ambiguity or deliberate ambiguity, NATO cannot kick, I mean, it does not have that capacity to kick any of its members out. If the European Union wishes to create its own European structure, that can be seen as a threat for Turkey, but I don't believe that Europe has such deep pockets and has intentions to leave the luxury of US paying for its defense. It didn't till now. I don't believe it will go there. And Turkey's, as I indicated, the real estate value, what I call the real estate value, the location on the map, that is something you cannot turn around. So, yes, the relation is now relegated to an operational level. But also looking from Ankara or looking from even not from the government's perspective, but through the any of the opposition perspective, people look and see that US has a good relation with Egypt, for example, with a dictator like Sisi, or it has no problems with when it comes to cooperation with Saudi Arabia, for example. Yes, our relation with the US is not the same. It was not solely operational, but people can live with that. And when it comes to the image of US, image of Turkey here, image of America in Turkey, that is maybe for the image makers to worry about, but not for the statement or diplomats. And in general terms, diplomacy without diplomats, I'm afraid that is a general global trend also. It's not only particular to Turkey.
I should say, by the way, that my husband has been watching a Turkish serial on his computer that's set in the medieval period, and I have to find out what it is. So soft power works two ways. Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Hi, this is Namo Abdullah with Rudao. It's an Iraqi Kurdish news network. I have a question for Mr. Aydin. Last time,
we know each other actually from
I know. In 2010, I was a translator with the late American journalist Anthony Shadid, who interviewed you. I remember that was the last time I saw you. Really nice to see you again.
You interviewed me actually, not Anthony.
Both of us. Yeah. So my question is, where do you see the? Actually, it's a twofold question. Where do you see the KRG-Turkish relationship now? Where is it going? And do you buy the Turkish government argument that Turkey is just against the PKK and not against all the Kurds, given the actions we've seen from the Erdogan administration against all sorts of Kurdish factions, including Iraqi Kurds when they went for independence referendum in 2017. Thank you.
Thank you. The second part of your question is difficult. It will take very long, it should take another panel probably, but the first bit, but I will get into that as well, but briefly. But that should be allocated much longer time, I believe. But the first bit is easier, the Turkey's relations with KRG. Very recently, a couple of days ago, the new KRG Prime Minister, Mr. Mesut Barzani, was in Ankara, and he was received and pictured also with Mr. Erdogan and with Mr. Çavuşoğlu as well. And as you look always for, the journalists and others like me, we look always for signs. The Kurdistan flag was predominantly in display in the picture when he was shaking hands with Mr. Çavuşoğlu. Between Turkey and KRG, there is the complementarity of, this Turkish construction companies goes there. We sell all sorts of agricultural products. It is the business-friendly gateway to Iraq, so to speak, so on and so forth. Oil and everything. And there is, particularly between Nechirvan Barzani and Mr. Erdogan, I was part of that process when they had their first initial meetings at that time. And now that Nechirvan Barzani is elected as the new regional president, that is there, and it is from that narrow angle, yes, definitely PKK is different, KDP, and even not at the level of KDP, but PUK also is different, because when you say PKK, is always, it goes into the counter-terrorism territory, but KDP and PUK, it is political, and it is true that Turkish Armed Forces is conducting a huge military operation inside the Iraqi Kurdistan region in Hakurk. It started in Hakurk, then it extended towards Haftanin. It's the so-called Pençe first two. And this is not, by the way, by no way criticized like the Turkish military operation in Syria by neither the US nor the EU. Not even Baghdad or even Erbil also criticizes that military operation. Now, it is also a fact that the internal politics in the previous panels, in the first panels, this was widely discussed. Yes, at the time when I was Turkey's Consul General, if I had some success in my diplomatic performance, it was because of the political will, because of the political briefing I had and the support that I had. It was, and Prime Minister Erdogan was in charge of that policy. And he is the one also who overturned those policies now, and he's, for political reasons, internal reasons, and after the failed military coup attempt, and the certain electoral results, he is now working with, instead of the Turkey's Kurds and People's Democratic Party, now he is working with the nationalists. And it worked till now. Tomorrow, if Mr. Erdogan sees that it is not working, whether can he switch back again to the previous policies, I do not know. Also, some argue that these military operations conducted against the Syrian Kurds in Syria can be a prelude to a new peace process, but there is no sign in sight about that. But there is an argument which is always, talked about in Turkey. It is there as well. But one thing is a fact. If there are 35 to 40 million Kurds in these four countries, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, half of those are citizens of the Republic of Turkey. And the largest population of Kurds in the world is in my hometown, is Istanbul. It's not in Diyarbakir, not in Erbil. So a peaceful solution, a peaceful political solution to how to have a better democratic union, how to have a better republic is inevitable. If it's not happening today, it will happen tomorrow. If now there are the mayors elected of the People's Democratic Party in the southeastern Turkey are being replaced, if there is repression, if there are military operations, so on and so forth, still tomorrow, after tomorrow, at some point, a peaceful political solution is and remains inevitable. But that's really, probably it will take another panel to discuss about that. But I will just add this last sentence. The oversimplification of Turkey's relations with the Kurds is disturbing. So it's not like, if I may say that, it's not like cowboys and Indians. It's not like Washington Redskins against New York Giants. It's not like that, really. It's not Kurds, Turks. They are enemies of each other since 1,000 years, and so on and so forth. But we have to find another way to go forward from this point on. Whether it is happening now, not really, but it will happen sometime. It is inevitable.
Yes, lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Fatiha Tabibi. I'm a student of political science at George Mason. My question is for Mr. Zanotti. So the U.S. under CATSA is threatening Egypt with sanction if they were to buy 20 Su-35s from the Russians. If the U.S. is not able to impose sanctions on Turkey, how is that other countries are gonna, take this threat as seriously, particularly Middle Eastern countries that are interested in buying Russian weapons? Thank you.
Great question. Something that I think I'm very, very confident that the administration, we know that there was, I think it was Senators Graham and Van Hollen, I don't know if it was a letter to the administration, but some sort of message transmitted just in the last few days that seemed to kind of hint at that too, this notion of, on principle, can we let this pass? Yeah, and you've got, it's not just Egypt, right? The Saudis are talking about S-400. Other Gulf states, the Qataris, I believe, maybe even considering S-400, and I think the UAE is talking about some sort of Russian weapons purchases as well. So this is a broad issue for countries that the U.S. Either partners with or has stations hugely strategically important assets and personnel in, or both. There's also, I guess, a question, though, of if you impose the sanctions and the other countries are willing to call you on that because they feel as though they have to hedge, are you credible in what stance you take? And I think some of the commentary that I've just been seeing over the last few weeks seem to be starting to get to that nub of, okay, what truly is the point at which, the red line at which the United States is not going to allow this to take place? Right, and then there's this additional question of is Turkey different because it's a NATO country, right? Is there something a little bit fundamentally different from the DNA of NATO where, look, okay, Egypt and Saudi, we're going to take it on its own terms. Yes, they're regional countries. Yes, there are some similar principles involved, but this is a little different here with Turkey because it's NATO. And as Barbara, I think, alluded to a little bit earlier, and General Votel spoke to, this just, how can you, if you're going to acquire a major weapons platform, possibly more than one, how does that going to square with NATO's sort of core founding mission?
Somebody, okay, sure, go ahead. Wait for the mic, yeah? This gentleman here, yeah.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I've been puzzled about S-400 in one way. As an Intel guy, I'm thinking Russia's selling their top-of-the-line system to an ally. This is a gift straight from Allah. And can we persuade the Turks to buy the Borai submarine as well? Why would Russia give this intelligence gift to the West? Are they that hard up for cash?
I think that's a question for you. And also for General Votel. Yeah.
I don't think that anybody takes it for an intelligence gift, but rather as a strategic asset which you share with, yes, with the country which is formally and practically in the alliance which is at odds with Russia. But look at it not as a single example. Look at what Putin said 2 months ago, that Russia actually shared early warning technology, early warning against nuclear attack technology with China. It means that if China buys it, it means that China is going to engage in what? Nuclear deterrence relationship with the United States, something what did not exist so far. Otherwise, you do not need early warning capability. I think that that S-400 for regional powers becomes a symbol, a political symbol of some strategic sovereignty. And that strategic sovereignty, I think, and that issue is not only for the relations with the United States, but also for relations of the countries in the region between themselves. Because why there is a role of external powers in the region? Because there are unresolvable disputes between regional countries, and they need outsiders to be part of their balance. And I think that we should look at that, how that is going to adjust regional balances, and how that is going to adjust the role of external powers in the regional balances. And I think from this perspective, what is very relevant is the very first question, and the question of the PhD student, the lady, that the Western powers, the external powers in the region, demonstrate very low credibility to do anything. Because the issue of ambiguity, the issue of what is going on with sanctions, finally it is an issue of credibility. So my sum up is I think we should look at it not only from the perspective of relations of Turkey with NATO, Russia, NATO, Turkey, and so on, but also what role it will have for the regional balances of power. Maybe you are right. Actually, there is an incentive for regional powers to get S-104 before your immediate competitors.
The Iranians apparently are
yes.
considering such a purchase
so
as well.
I think it becomes a sort of regional dynamic. Get it before your immediate competitor. But the issue is that Russia is going to sell it to competitors, or at least discussing it.
Yeah. Let me ask General Votel, is there any intelligence benefit to the United States with Turkey acquiring the S-400?
Well, there may be. We have a wonderful intelligence community, and there may be ways that perhaps through a collection or other things that we can learn more about the system and ultimately use that to kind of safeguard us. So I think there may be. I wouldn't say there aren't some things we can do. There probably are. We're probably not in the forum to discuss that right now. But I would like to just add here. I think the idea of strategic sovereignty is an important one here, but that to me answers more the question as to why Turkey's buying it or why Iran's buying it or pursuing it or why others are buying it, is they do see this as a symbol of independence and their own sovereignty in terms of that. My belief here is that what Russia is doing and what Russia's angle on this is that this is an opportunity to drive a wedge into NATO. And it is an opportunity to undermine us. And I don't know that they're necessarily concerned about making sure that Turkey is provided with the very best military capabilities, but I think they are interested with trying to use Turkey as in the provision of this equipment as a way to undermine NATO, probably recognizing, as we've already discussed here, we don't have a good way of right now, or not, at least an evident way, that we are going to address this with Turkey. Our government is wrestling with it. NATO is looking to us, and they're wrestling with it, but even not as much as we are. So I think it's a very fairly effective play on the part of Mr. Putin here to try to undermine the relevance of NATO and peel off a partner here and do it without any way for the members of NATO, to include the United States, to kind of address it. I mean, in many ways, it's kind of a slow approach to decreasing the capabilities of NATO. I really think it's about undermining NATO.
Yeah, Jim, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, one is, I guess the question that I have is, how does that export version compare with the version that the Russians deploy on their own? And then, based on that, then how valuable would any intelligence be? The other point that I just wanted to make sure that we focus on a little bit is how important General Votel got to a little bit talking about this notion of independence. The Turks talk about tech transfer and an independent capability till the cows come home. This is something that they publicly talk about quite a bit, and the Russians have talked to them about this idea that down the road that perhaps there could be tech transfer that would then allow them, co-production, that would then allow them to essentially integrate that into their own projects down the road. And so just recognizing that this is something that, how important it is in the scheme of things, I'm not sure, because if you peel back this specific S-400 transaction, it doesn't seem like there's much, if at all, real tech transfer going on, but it's sort of a question of how does that play into the negotiating process, the high-level politics that then lead to decisions and timeframes, and could have very real impact on Turkey's strategic orientation over time.
Dr. Safranchik, I have to ask you this. I mean, the United States has been very unreliable in the region, not just under Trump, but going back to Obama, a lot of uncertainty over when the U.S. would intervene militarily, when it wouldn't intervene militarily. How does Russia see its role just generally in the region? I mean, clearly we have military interventions in Syria, Libya, arms sales increasing throughout the region. Does Russia see itself as just competing with the United States or supplanting the United States in terms of its relationships with a lot of these countries?
I think it is more with what the general said. It's now very much about undermining the credibility, undermining the very image and the core functions and the will which is behind quite strong capability. The West is possessing extraordinary capability. That continues to be the case. What is ambiguity about? Ambiguity is about the will to act. And I think that the game is very much right now for each side to try to undermine each other's will. And Russia is playing that game seemingly for now more effectively than the West is playing the game. We don't know what will be in the longer run, but it is right now. So right now, I think it is about undermining the will of the West. And I am not sure that that is a strategic choice to behave. I think it's more taken as a choice of necessity. After Crimea crisis and after all that, Russia feels that it becomes an existential, actually, period for Russia. Either it survives or it can be kept down or put down. And then it becomes the issue of guaranteeing your survival through undermining the will of the other side to act. However, I would draw your attention to what Russia did before that. Russia was also going at odds with the West before Crimea, but not exactly in the same way. I think what Russia looked for that period, what Russia looked for in that period was not substituting the United States in various regional balances. So we just push the United States away and we become masters of various difficult issues. I don't think that was the case. I think Russia was somehow thinking about managing issues without the United States, but not against the United States. And I think it was resonating with what was the mood in the United States, how actually to disengage from some places. The Bush was campaigning on the issue that we need to a little bit get out of world affairs. Obama was campaigning with something like that. Both of them finally were re-engaging rather than disengaging. But it looked like there was some consumption for that, some appetite for that in the United States. And Russia was saying, okay, probably we can do something without you, but not against you. What is also acceptable? Because of the various events, the Crimean issue in particular, all that is screwed up. And Russia went into all this game of undermining the West. But I think that there could be some potential of reviving that earlier pattern if it is possible to have some regional arrangements, Russia, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, Iran, Turkey, and so on. Without the United States, or with some low American participation, but not against the United States, and accommodating U.S. some very basic interests, vital interests, if the very possibility for that could be revived, I think that would be an exit from where we are now. And where we are now is exactly what was the first question about. There is no will to act and not enough capability to act. Are we going to build both and go into really good wars, or we find a way out?
Okay, I think we are out. Last word, okay, last word.
I was trying to catch your attention.
We are pretty much out of time, so one point, go ahead.
One sentence to add both to my co-panelists. It should be also the appetite of Turkey to build its own defense industry should not be missed when it comes to armed unmanned aerial vehicles, for example, that are sold to Libya and Ukraine. The 4 Ada-class corvettes sold, 2 of them will be to Pakistan, 2 will be built in Karachi, 2 will be built in Istanbul. Based on the Spanish blueprint, 2 light aircraft carriers, or the helicopter carriers, are being built. One of them will be commissioned very soon, the other one. So there is this appetite to build its own defense industry, both actually for political reasons, for real business economic reasons, but also for military reasons, to be fully independent at some point. But also, before coming to that point, in general terms, today's Turkish foreign policy is that sort of lone cowboy. Go it alone. I can do it on my own. I don't need anyone. Me against the world. Okay. That translates as such, and it works always. It resonates with the general public opinion.
Me against the world, or me without the world?
All right. Well, I want to thank our speakers. We could go on and on. This is really fascinating, and thank our audience for sticking with us all day. You'll do this again next year, yes? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, once again, thank you all for coming. This was great. Thank you, Barbara, and our panelists, and we'll see you next year.